now I'm very, very pleased to welcome our first panel. And it's entitled, We've Had the Answers All Along. And that's a little bit of a controversial title. I know that our panelists will unpack it during the conversation. And I'm hoping that the panelists can talk about the value of Indigenous and traditional practices, but also if there is, and this is a question, if there's an opportunity to combine them with other innovations and technologies. So joining us for this conversation, we have A-dae Romero Briones of the First Nations Development Institute. We also have Racelis, an assistant professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. We have Jehiel, who is the CEO and founder of Hello Tractor. And our moderator is Sweta Chakraborty, the CEO of WeDontHaveTime here in North America. So I'd love to invite them to the stage. Sweta, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, and let's give it up for Danny and Food Tank. This is incredible. Look at all of you showing up bright and early on Sunday, daylight savings and all. Super impressed. Well done, everybody. Fellow panelists, please join me on stage. And if any of you are tired, you definitely won't be by the end of this panel and by the end of today, and with all of this food and drink, too, to support you and all of your needs as we really get into some critical discussions around the future of food and how we are going to create and usher in a future that is equitable, that is truly equitable access to nutritious foods for all, and with some great challenges as well, which includes, of course, the planet warming, which includes an increasing population. And there's so many great people and groups that are working in this space, but do we need to reinvent the wheel? That's what this panel is going to be getting into and discussing. If we actually are not giving the credit to those who have ancestral knowledge and have especially deep insights from their particular regions within the United States and around the world, do we really need to reinvent the wheel? Can't we actually just pull from what communities already know works and see how we could potentially scale those solutions and accelerate overcoming this climate crisis? So I can't imagine a better panel to discuss all of this with me than, and Danny already did the introductions, so I'll keep it really brief. We have A-dae, we have Alex, we have Jehiel, and I'm gonna kick it off first with A-dae. Let's get into this. Let's get into this topic. Have we had the answers all along? How can traditional knowledge and practices from Indigenous communities really become more integrated into modern and future agroecological farming? Please, take it away.
I'm Coach T in Kiowa, so let's start there. Second, are there other Indigenous people in the room? If you are out there, please raise your hand. Okay, well, as the Indigenous person in the room right now, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here on a Sunday morning so early. I really appreciate my fellow panelists. I all appreciate your time, and thank you for grounding yourselves in this discussion with us this morning. So let's jump into it. One of the reasons Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people are such the center of attention right now is because we find ourselves in a crisis. We find ourselves in a world that needs a different worldview, that needs a different grounding, that needs to look at things rather than extractive. So when we have this conversation, it's not about Indigenous practices, it's about Indigenous people. You can't have the practices without the people. And so whenever we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, we're often put in the conversation as like the reverse engineers. We are not reverse engineers for capitalism. We are not reverse engineers for environmental damage. We are communities, we are people, we hold a different worldview, and that framework is what is important to this conversation, not necessarily just the practice, not necessarily just the processes, not necessarily our seeds, not necessarily, it's the people and the community and the worldview and the frameworks that change the way we have this conversation.
Fantastic, thank you, yes. And we have leaders from historically disenfranchised communities here on this stage, And we're fortunate for that. But obviously, as you just pointed out, there needs to be more representation so we can really have that big picture and perspective on some of these grand challenges that we face. And to do that also, we need to partner outside of just the private sector. We really need to build relationships with the public sector and academic institutions. So Alex, as the Associate Professor of Agroecology at the University of Texas, you're really forging those types of relationships. You're doing that primary research that can really be picked up and implemented. So talk to us a little bit more about the role that academic institutions can play.
Well, good morning. A-dae mentioned something just extremely powerful. I think the first thing is to recognize that academic institutions, unfortunately, are part of the issue, where we have become a little bit more divorced from people, thinking about research questions, thinking about how we teach our students. There's been a increasing focus on outputs and not really focusing on outcomes. So how can we harness the largesse of these institutions and all that funding that goes into those institutions to really answer the questions that people are asking, farmers are asking, ranchers are asking. One way to do that is to reconnect with certain communities and reconnect with certain constituencies who really need help, right? And so, farmers, small farmers in particular, minority communities in particular, where there has been an underinvestment in research, there's been an underinvestment in education, and a greater focus on people, as A-dae mentioned, is one step that I think academic institutions needs to take if they want to really help some of these communities.
I love that. As a social scientist myself, I'm always making that case, right? We need anthropologists, we need sociologists, we need behavioral scientists, because that human element gets lost in some of these solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a social scientist, but I do know that as someone who works as an agronomist, I realize that it's not just about plants or soils, it's not just about insects or bugs and pests. It's about the outcomes of those practices. And unfortunately, a lot of our farmers are locked into farming systems that maximize production and yield, and they're forced to ignore some of the social and environmental impacts of that farming practice. And I think universities play an important role of decoupling that and trying to discover other alternative ways or traditional ways that focus more on a holistic view of agriculture and ranching.
And I love that collaboration is there, right? Hard science, soft science. And that's needed, because if we're going to solve these massive, global, complex, interconnected challenges, we need all hands on deck. And Jehiel, let's turn to you on that, because you're really focusing in on sub-Saharan Africa. Based out of the US, you see that this is actually, ground zero for a lot of the challenges that we're facing. Mm-hmm. And what are you seeing as some of these, some practices, agroecological practices that smallholder farmers we can learn from smallholder farmers that are going to be scalable in Africa and beyond?
Yeah, well, a lot of the farmers that we work with, unfortunately, can't afford to invest in some of the more destructive practices that we've seen in North American agriculture and large agriculture more broadly. At Hello Tractor, we work with 630,000 smallholder farmers growing on roughly about 1.7 million acres, and we help to get them tractor services so they can plant on time and cultivate the land they have access to. Now, traditionally across Africa, that has been the disc plow. And as we all know, we got some agronomists here. That's terrible for the soil fertility and long-term soil health and the financial health of these farmers in the future. And so what we've been doing is putting incentives in place to promote things like no-till agriculture, more regenerative forms of ag. And because we're introducing mechanization for the first time in many of our farmers' fields, 55% of our customers receive tractors in their field for the first time in their lives through Hello Tractor. So there's an opportunity to leapfrog some of the more destructive practices in the U.S. and in global commercial agriculture, because that muscle memory really isn't in place in our markets. And then touching on the point that you brought up around the social sciences, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, right? I can't show up at a smallholder farmer's field in the middle of Nigeria or Kenya or any of the markets we work in and discuss regenerative agriculture, right? But what we've been able to do is leverage the social capital that already exists in these communities by working through community-based agents, so they can be the change agents to communicate these improved production practices and influence the farmers to change those behaviors for their own benefit, both financially and environmentally.
I love that. That's behavioral science 101. It's actually identifying trusted spokespeople to be able to share information that is relevant to particular communities and ultimately close whatever distrust gaps might exist. And so that's smart. It's obvious, right? When we're talking about it, it seems so obvious, but it's sad how little it's been implemented. And I think nobody knows this better than A-dae, and how little Indigenous elders, community members have been integrated into these higher level policy conversations, higher level innovation, reaching commercial viability conversations. Talk to us a little bit about the integration that has happened of Indigenous knowledge into solutions, and how much further we still have to go.
Absolutely. Well, this is a tough question, because again, we're talking about worldviews. When we live in a society that's capitalistic and everything, including people, has value and can be put on the market, knowledge can be put on the market. And when there's the absence of sacredness, when there's an absence of something that can't be put on the market, it's really, really hard to protect. And so Indigenous communities find themselves in this very separated system, in that we can't put forth knowledge without it being capitalized, without it being captured for some kind of benefit, not to us. And in order to include Indigenous knowledge in solutions, include Indigenous knowledge in the conversation, more and more people need to recognize that not everything is for sale. And as long as we've had the slavery conversation, as long as we've had this land conversation, there's still so much work we have to do as a society to get to that point, to recognize not everything is for sale. Once I think that happens, that wave happens, when the majority of us recognize there's a sacredness to how we eat, to the food and the land that we come from, I think we'll see more and more Indigenous people in the conversation. Until then, there's going to be a reluctance to share much.
Yeah, and yes, please. Thank you for sharing that. You know, the name of my company is We Don't Have Time. And so we don't have time to wait. We should have solved this crisis before it even came to fruition. And here we are now backpedaling, really trying to catch up to what we've known for decades and what Indigenous groups have known for centuries was going to happen if we didn't respect the planet and the one home that we have, that we collectively share. So we don't have time. We have to move quickly. We have to bring diverse voices to the decision-making table so that we can accelerate these solutions and really see a planet that is truly equitable, which is exciting, bringing a vision of a future that is better than anything we've ever actually created in the past. So that is hopefully what will come out of this. Alex, talk to us a little bit about your research. How is your work looking to improve agricultural sustainability? How is it looking to advance rural communities? How do we need to make sure that everybody is uplifted as we actually envision this new, more equitable, more breathable future?
You know, again, this comes back to what A-dae mentioned. You know, I mean, how do we include people in the conversation? And so there needs to be more examples of participatory research where farmers, where communities are invited into the conversation about what are the questions being asked, right? So that it starts there. I mean, that's what the research enterprise does, is we ask questions, and hopefully we discover answers or solutions to some of the issues that we look at. But often the questions, increasingly, in the last 150 years, the questions are really not farmer focused, and they become questions that, corporations might be asking, or even individuals, just based out of curiosity. And I think, like in our program, we try to include farmers in the way that we ask the questions, the way that we write proposals for funding, and we bring them into the actual experiment design, and we even ask them to help interpret the results. And often we agree when we take all of our scientific data, we take all our exact measurements, and we ask farmers, well, what do you think? And they're like, well, this is how I would rank these things. And almost always they're spot on, right? And I think having them more involved in the research enterprise, and not just as a participant, but a contributor, and also that we include them in a budget, for example, right? So a lot of the farmers we work with, they receive a compensation for their time and effort, and we don't have any of these large experimental field stations, so we have to conduct a lot of our research on farm, at farm scales, with kind of that include rural realities, that include issues around weather and rainfall, and sometimes we have to adapt quickly, but that takes in the kind of reality of farming in those conditions.
Sure.
And I think by including these people in that conversation, well, that's at the heart of my program, but it's not too common in the academic enterprise, unfortunately.
Yeah. Wow. That is such a great, not experiment, because you're showing it's working. So it's one of those initiatives that really need to be scaled across universities throughout the United States, around the world. We're seeing that incorporating Indigenous folks, incorporating farmers as collaborators, as contributors, is resulting in realizing that they had the answers all along. And there's something to be said for that. So there's real benefit to this, and it's also bringing the communities and having them become part of the solution and having them become beneficiaries of the solution. And that's critical for adoption and for policy support.
So the answer isn't necessarily in the research, right? The answer is in the collaboration and the conversations and that kind of that community-centered approach. And so sometimes the answer is, no, it doesn't work, but we learn it together. And I think that is the answer. Not the actual product of the research, but the process.
Sure. Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for sharing that. And so, Jehiel, would you agree? And is engaging and involving with these small-scale farmers in Africa, are we able to ensure that the solutions will be adopted and will also benefit the farmers? How do we ensure that those that are, being introduced and being involved as part of the process will truly feel the fruits of the effort?
Yeah, well, number one, I think we're a private company, so our farmers vote with their wallets, and so if they don't like what we're selling, they won't buy it, and we won't be on stages and get delicious breakfast tacos. But I think at a more strategic level, at inception, as a company, we hired engineers and data scientists from the markets that we work within. And touching on this theme of tapping into indigenous knowledge, we got some great, technologists who come from the communities that we service, and they have an intimate understanding of the pain points of a smallholder farmer because their mom is a smallholder farmer. And so they're building a solution not for John Deere, who's our biggest investor, but for their mom. So they approach the problems very differently. And the irony is that value unlock is what John Deere invested in. And so if you take a step back, and this is a conversation that goes beyond the food system, understanding your value is so important. And it's something that we preach within Hello Tractor, because we got all these young people who are not the obvious choice when you think about software engineers and data scientists, and but they're the right choice, and they are out competing the tens of thousands of engineers that John Deere has on their payroll, because what they have of value is something that John Deere doesn't have, and that's a deep, intimate understanding of a massive market. And putting that insight to work is helping close the yield gap and creating food sovereignty within the markets that we operate in, and doing it with these regenerative efforts at the forefront, right? So that's a cool example of how we all have value to bring. It's not just, big corporations even need us for them to succeed and protect and grow shareholder value. And we can direct them towards the right answers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I appreciate you talking about how it's all connected in that way. What are some of the challenges you're facing still to you, Jehiel? And then same question to the panelists as we use this perhaps as our closing remarks. What would you like to share with this audience and to the wider public in terms of how they can get engaged and they can help, especially overcoming some of the barriers that you're facing in seeing through your projects to success?
One of the biggest challenges in African agriculture is, agriculture represents about 40% of the continent's GDP, 60% of the labor force. Less than 2% of commercial bank lending goes in agriculture, so it's undercapitalized. We launched a tractor finance product because there was just never enough tractors to service the demand being originated by our agents in the communities. And so we started financing these agents to actually become tractor owners themselves. These are unbanked entrepreneurs. About a quarter of them are women who get to own their own equipment and service their smallholder farmers directly. And that was a huge kind of way to stimulate more equipment being sold in these markets. And we incentivize, again, going back to incentives, if you're booking farmers for regenerative ag, conservation, zero-till, you don't have to pay a down payment. And that's a hell of an incentive for somebody who don't have money for a down payment, right? So they can convince their farmer friends to do things the right way. But we need more. And it's not a problem that Hello Tractor can solve. We're a small company. And so we need a whole entire ecosystem. And I don't think we have to be combative, right? We work in a system, like the human body is a system. And everybody has a role to play in that system, right? You got academia here. We got activism is important. You got the private sector. You got small, little shitty tech companies like Hello Tractor. And we all coming together, trying to solve these massive problems, right? And we should be thoughtful about where there's alignment and overlap of incentives. Let's focus there and push, because we don't have time. And so we need to get over ourselves and work together to solve these deeply entrenched problems.
Well, all the power to you and all the future success to scale your solution throughout Africa, throughout the world. Thank you, Jehiel. Alex.
Well, from an academic point of view, from an academic perspective, I think the challenge is to reimagine the role of academic institutions in this system. We have structures within academia that are 170 years old or older, and we maintain them. One of those structures is this idea of the unbiased work, right? And it's a conversation we're having now in the United States about the role of values in institutions, and I think that conversation has pushed out this idea of justice-centered research or justice-centered education, because they're saying, well, no, we don't want to include any of that in the way that we do our work or that we do our research. But ultimately, it's about serving a broad constituency, and sometimes we have to understand that as a public institution, that we have an important role as an anchor in our communities. and that we have to include and value those values and worldviews that those communities, those students, those farmers that we serve, and we have to include that in the way that we do our work. That's a huge challenge because these academic institutions are big, powerful institutions, organizations, and they don't want to let go some of those systems. So that's the big challenge that we have.
Oh, I love that. As a recovering academic, that really resonates with me too, so I appreciate it. A-dae, we started with you. I would love for you to have the final word in this panel.
I think every single one of us has a role in how we shape our future. And part of that shaping comes from the practices and the relationships that we have with one another. Agriculture is only about 10,000 years old. Well, there's probably people who can tell me exactly how old it is. Academic institutions are 170-year-olds. Human community, family systems, relationships are much older than all of those things. And that's how we're going to hold each other accountable. And those are the things that are going to shape our future. And we have to learn how to speak of them in value. We have to learn how to remember how valuable it is to be part of a community. And if you don't have one, find one and be accountable to it. That's how we're going to reshape our future.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's take that ancestral knowledge. Let's take academic knowledge. Let's collaborate with farmers. Let's make sure that we lift everybody up as we usher in this new future that we are going to collectively be contributing to. Thank you so much to my expert panelists for their perspectives and their contributions to this topic. Thank you all of you for being so engaged, and have a great rest of this event.